Yes. Yes, we would look to, a lot of the state bond money requires a 50% local match. Some of that is waived for severely disadvantaged communities, but right now, for some of the projects and programs that we envision, that state match would have to come out of the existing revenue stream for the districts, and right now, that's very much constrained because of the impacts of not only the drought, but long-term from the contractual delivery reductions from the federal and state projects. So we view this as necessary to be able to not only fund local projects, but to be able to secure, federal and state money on a matching basis.
Thank you, Ken. That was an important clarification. So, Mr. Lester Snow, I think you're next, and we're looking forward to the rest of the proposals.
Thank you, Secretary Ross, distinguished panel. First, I want to know if Bob gets extra points because he came in with a legislative language. So it's like, okay, his homework assignment was completed, then the rest of ours, okay, I get it now. And he went first. Okay. Anyway, so many of the issues have been covered. Karen did an excellent job of kind of summarizing the issues that we've seen. I want to mention very briefly, for some probably don't know what the California Water Foundation is, and I'll just say quickly, it is a nonprofit whose focus is exclusively sustainable water management in California. And based on the assumption that our water supplies are not resilient, not reliable, and not sustainable, and action needs to be taken across the board, conservation, wastewater recycling, stormwater capture. But I think probably the single most critical element in achieving sustainability in California is groundwater. And effectively managed, it is the single biggest mechanism that gives us the flexibility to deal with the vagaries of our water system in California. And if we cannot get our hands around that, we will not have a sustainable water supply. I am tech savvy, as it turns out. Karen Ross covered much of this. There's a couple things I want to hit in terms of the groundwater context. We are now using the numbers 40% in an average year and 60% in a dry year. As recently as 2 years ago, we were still using 30 and 40. And it's changing so much in terms of our dependence on groundwater. It is a critical part of integrated water management, or to use a different term, conjunctive water management. There are some areas of the state that are 100% dependent on groundwater, but by and large, where we use groundwater, they're using surface water, and in some places using wastewater. So it's just an integral part of the system and how we have to manage the system. Groundwater, in my opinion, has the distinction of providing the greatest flexibility, both in terms of a source of supply as well as storage. And we see the storage flexibility in action in places like the Kern Water Bank or Semi-Tropic and other places like that, where they're able to put water away for multiple years, not have to draw it down every year as we do in surface storage. And then this year just highlights the flexibility in use, where we're seeing in some areas they are pumping 4 to 5 times what you'd call the safe yield of the basin. That would mean pumping or diverting 5 times the flow of a river. Well, you can't. But in groundwater, you have that flexibility. We've seen the increase for a number of reasons, and we heard it from a lot of the people that we talked to. A reduction in surface supplies. 2 primary reasons there. One, climate change has had an effect on our surface supplies, and environmental protections has changed the amount of available water. In almost all of those cases, those reductions in surface supplies have been offset by increasing pumping. The final thing that I would say in context that we're very well aware of, and is largely the reason we're here today, a dramatic increase in landowner conflicts over groundwater, and we're going to see that continue. And I would add the editorial comment that if we don't address it, we're going to see more and more adjudications, more and more court cases, and more rich water attorneys. Yeah. Let me know if anybody's approaching me from behind. This is the last background piece for this. Is just so important, the interconnectedness of the system. Every time we fix a problem by looking at the silo, we make a mistake. And we've got to look at groundwater in the broader context. Pumping groundwater will divert surface water. Reducing surface water deliveries will increase groundwater pumping. Some of our land use activities contaminate groundwater, and we have to manage in the entire system. And this groundwater management situation that we're dealing with now is a piece of that, but we have to keep the broader situation in mind. What I want to do fairly quickly is go through our process, our outreach efforts as we developed our recommendations, our draft findings, what we heard, our draft recommendations, close with a little bit about the critical issues or challenging issues in pulling together legislation, and then a little bit on our next steps. In terms of outreach, shortly after the governor's office held a meeting on groundwater, pulling in stakeholders, I think on February 12th, we formed a stakeholder steering committee of 13 members, a very diverse group, to bring in ideas and review our ideas. So far they have met 3 times and have provided a lot of input to the process, and they are our next stop as we finalize our draft. We also held 5 large group meetings with counties, environmental and environmental justice organizations, agriculture, water managers, specific and formal outreach groups. In addition, we met individually with a lot of stakeholders and interests, state administration and legislative discussions, well over 200 connections that we made on these topics. Very quickly on the draft findings, because Karen Ross and Karen Torkovich did a good job of covering this. We really found a broad 100% understanding that groundwater is essential to the economy and the environment and public health and safety. It's a drinking water supply and a critical component to that. I think there's also a broad, and I would say 100% understanding that current trends are not sustainable. We cannot keep going in this direction. We've already covered the fact that groundwater is most effectively managed locally and regionally. Subsidiarity. It's been pointed out to me, that's been in a number of the governor's speeches lately, which basically means don't manage centrally, which is better managed at a lower level. And that could not be more true in terms of groundwater. Local groundwater management entities do not have the tools and authorities that they need. It's almost by design that we have not provided those tools. And close off on the findings. I think there's a broad agreement that the state needs to have a clear and meaningful role. There is also great concern about the state having too much authority to be able to just step in whenever they want to. So there's an idea of a state backstop, but with limited use of the state backstop. The second bullet on the finding is a recognition that it took us 100 years to get here, and it's going to take some time to fix the problem that we have. Unanimous agreement that funding is needed to change the dynamic on this, and broad-based funding. Groundwater management needs to be inclusive and transparent. This even came up in the first presentation a little bit in terms of access to data, access to different non-traditional parties to this. Probably the 2 that came up the most often in terms of being included in the decision-making process was the underserved community, disadvantaged community, and then also the independent pumpers, the white space that we're talking about. Nobody's representing them, so how are they involved in this? And then the final point is the property rights issue of respecting and protecting property rights. And of course, we believe that effective sustainable management is the way that you protect people's property rights. On to the recommendations. A quick summary first. We have 8 basic recommendations. One is that there needs to be a statutory definition of sustainable groundwater management. We need to develop a prioritized approach based on subbasins need to establish local groundwater management entities that then will receive new authorities, very specific authorities. Develop sustainable groundwater management plans. I mean, specifying how we will modify AB 3030 and 1938 plans. And then the state role. What precisely is the state role in implementing this? Later in our process, we developed a concept around adjudication. So if there's a way to reduce the cost and time associated with adjudications, that's something that we're still working on, but we think can play a major role in moving forward on this. And then eighth point is simply more money. I'm not going to spend much time on this slide now. I'll have it up again later, but there is a framework that this, and that's what we look at this as building a state framework that empowers the locals to work within. And I'll get back to this in a moment. Now, I think actually Aqua, when Tim and Dave are talking, they have a definition fairly close to this. I think we're in the ballpark on this, but our definition is that sustainable groundwater management means management of groundwater subbasins to provide for multiple long-term benefits without resulting in or aggravating conditions that cause significant economic, social, or environmental impacts, such as long-term overdraft, land subsidence, ecosystem degradation, depletion of surface water bodies, or water quality degradation. So I think it needs to be some definition like that that's in statute. It may require some rule development subsequently, but there needs to be a solid definition. Our second recommendation goes to the scope. Where does this apply? Where do you need to achieve the sustainability? So first, the program needs to apply statewide. There needs to be a single program, but it's based on the subbasins as identified in Bulletin 118. We should prioritize those subbasins using the CASGEM analysis that was published in December to focus on high and medium basins. It's been pointed out that there may be some of the low and very low priority basins that could be at a tipping point, that just a little more pumping may take it from a basin that appears to be in equilibrium to dewatering groundwater dependent ecosystems. So we're suggesting that DWR work with the Department of Fish and Wildlife to evaluate this issue and potentially come up with criteria. Also, even though CASGEM is the best instrument out there, the best existing definition of boundaries, they're not all perfect. And so I think DWR needs to develop a formal criteria or formal process for amending boundaries. The way this plays out, this is the CASGEM map with all the different basins. We have overlaid adjudicated basins on this. What we're recommending is that the law, when it passes, applies immediately to the high and medium basins and not the rest of the state. That the low and very low would come along subsequently. And we haven't set that time period, but it would not apply to them initially and they would not have to respond. Also, I'd point out, it was a big issue for some of the rural counties that we met with, this doesn't apply to the fractured rock areas. Which really don't have classic aquifers in the sense that we described them here. The third recommendation is the establishment of local groundwater management entities. You have a subbasin, who's in charge? What we have said so far is that each subbasin must be within the jurisdiction of a single local groundwater management entity. But on the second bullet, we soften that a little bit in that this local groundwater management entity can be an existing entity tied together by a JPA, tied together by MOUs, or some other mechanism. So in that case, each of the existing entities could maintain their jurisdiction and their identity, but somehow tie together by agreement, but also provide the option under this legislation to create a new entity. So it would be a generic formulation of a special act district. They could simply go in and we elect to do that and they get the authorities. The authorities that we'll describe next would become available upon the formation of this local entity, or description of the local entity, and we're proposing that it would need to happen within 2 years from formation, within 2 years of the passage of the legislation. And again, the critical issue of open and transparent decision-making. Now, I'll just highlight here, the dark lines are a sub-basin boundary. And so you can see both at the top end and the bottom end some straight lines. And so the straight lines illustrate why there may need to be a need for there to be a process to modify the boundaries. But also highlighted in this is you see the white space. You see 3 groundwater management plans that are in that one sub-basin. And within those groundwater management plans are multiple jurisdictions. So there are dozens of jurisdictions embedded in those groundwater management plans. And then, it's not white on this one, but the tan space has no water management plan and are probably independent pumpers. You will also notice that in this sub-basin it cuts across 3 counties. And so that's why we're focused on wanting to pull together into a single groundwater management entity, however that is formed or however that is described. Recommendation 4 is the authorities, the local authorities that would be granted. Measuring and reporting on groundwater conditions, they can require that. They can allocate groundwater and manage pumping to achieve the objective of sustainability. Consistent with property rights, they have the ability to assess reasonable fees, allowing and approving groundwater transfers in the basin and sub-basin. Land use coordination with the counties. This is a big deal. That's a simple phrase, land use coordination. It came up everywhere in a lot of different ways. And so land use agencies are very protective of their ability to make land use decisions. All land use decisions have water implications to them. We have to make that connection in some fashion. And clearly the local entity needs the ability to enforce. Groundwater management plans. Each sub-basin would prepare one plan to achieve sustainable management, to achieve the definition as in recommendation 1. The groundwater management plans would subsume all of the requirements of AB 3030 as well as SB 1938, plus additional requirements. And a big one would be the actual development of a specific water budget. Water in, water out, how does that have to change in order to achieve sustainability? Development of interim milestones, 5-year milestones with very specific targets that would be enforceable targets. And this would happen, it says 2 to 3 years after the formation, but it's actually 4 or 5 years after the passage of the legislation. And then again, as I mentioned earlier, a much less urgent schedule for the lower priority basins. On to the state role. We got a lot of input on this, and a basic framework everybody agrees on, and it gets into the details that we find disagreement. Strong agreement on the need for technical assistance, and that's already come up in discussion this morning. In a sense that DWR needs to gear up to provide that technical assistance on data and characterization of basins, a variety of activities. Program oversight, following the development of a plan or the milestones or reviewing that, some sense of a shared responsibility between DWR and the state board, but the state board has to be involved in that stage because that's where your indication of enforcement is going to come from, or a need to intervene, I guess I would say, rather than enforcement. When it comes to enforcement and intervention, I don't think there's really any question that the state board needs to have clear and precise authorities to step in and articulate under what conditions and how they will step in, and perhaps with support from DWR. The fourth bullet is particularly important, the criteria and the process for state intervention. It's one thing to clearly articulate when the state has an interest where it needs to step in. It's another thing to have the real criteria that everybody understands and the precise process. Part of that is, if we're in trouble, do we have a period of time to remedy our own situation, that type. Nature of intervention can range from a water master to forcing an adjudication to putting them under some order and potential fines. The final point here is an issue that came up in a number of settings of regulatory relief. And some of that ranged from consolidation of reports, so they don't have to submit a CASGEM report over here and our Sustainable Water Management Plan over there, or water quality data to one place, and somehow consolidate that. The other concept embedded in this is a little more challenging, and that is if they do a comprehensive plan that is acceptable and it includes doing things, recharge basins or something like that, they at least get to go to the short line for permitting to do some of these things. That there's got to be some way of reducing, I call it the transaction costs associated with actually implementing sustainability. Now back to this slide. The locals in this scenario would have 2 years to figure out how they're going to meet the needs for covering an entire basin. Once they do that, they receive all the new authorities. They proceed with development of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Plan in a 4 to 5 year range that includes 5-year milestones with specific objectives and quantifiable targets. That would form the review that the state would perform to see if progress is being made. And then as we discussed this with a lot of different people, there's a sense that probably a 20-year time frame is reasonable to start from a basin in critical conditions to move to sustainable groundwater management. And I would highlight the first arrow coming in from the state. I guess it's the second arrow in plan preparation. Just strong interest in state assistance in developing data, managing data, and helping to fund especially basin characterizations. Recommendation 7. That is the administrative groundwater adjudication effort. And the concept here is especially if a sub-basin has proceeded, they've formed a jurisdiction, they're developing a plan, they're collecting a lot of information to try to push adjudication down to a lower level, and to use administrative law judges that have been pre-approved by the state board that are qualified in the area of groundwater, has the potential to reduce both time and cost, largely because you have already developed the technical record that would be necessary for this. This is a concept we're still working on and consulting with a number of water attorneys, because I think the attraction to this is if you really can cut the time and cost associated with adjudication, it can become a meaningful tool where you still have disputes. Recommendation 8 is the funding. I mean, I think there's a sense that everybody needs funding. The state board needs funding, DWR needs funding, the local entities need funding. So as we mentioned earlier, we would want the legislation to provide funding authority to the local entities to do withdrawal fees and raise funds in that fashion. We need to look for other mechanisms, including a fix of 218 that comes up in every conversation we have with local government. We need to look at the water bond, both existing revenues that we have from water bonds, but also if a bond moves this year. If a bond moves this year and it doesn't have groundwater in it, we have really made a big mistake. So it's critical to have that in there. There's only a handful of challenging issues when doing groundwater management in California. But we have to have the landowner rights, the property rights in front of us all the time. If it looks like we're doing a takings on this, we're in trouble. It'll draw national attention. And as I said earlier, achieving sustainable water management is a way to protect people's property rights. The linkage between groundwater management and water quality is something that we haven't completely nailed. Obviously, the way you manage groundwater, you manage plumes and you don't pull them into somebody's, safe water now. Where you put your recharge can help water quality. So there's a lot of pieces here. I don't think we quite have it nailed yet, and so we're still working on that. Already mentioned the inclusiveness and transparency. You can't manage something if you don't know how much is being used. I mean, that's just a basic principle. And we still have this concern that people shouldn't know how much I pump. It becomes a very divisive issue, and yet you can't manage what you don't know. So it's there in front of us, and it's an issue we're going to have to address in this legislation. Land use coordination and collaboration, that is going to have to be addressed squarely on. I think we probably will re-engage with the counties and some of the water managers on it. It has the appearance that this could become a divisive issue on this topic. And yet no one denies that land use decisions need to be informed by water availability, and land use decisions need to, or the other way around, I guess, the water availability needs to play a role as we decide when we're going to, I just noticed there was a timer over there. Have I been going on for 40 minutes? Is that what that? Oh, wow. Well, I have some pictures of my dogs and my family on the recent. Now, anyway, sorry. The final point may seem like an odd one, but it's the prevention versus reaction. We're here because we're reacting to crisis in our groundwater basins. And an issue, and I expect and want Maurice to address this a little bit also. There are basins where we're not experiencing severe overdraft. There's basins where we're not experiencing any subsidence of any sort. But they could be basins where the next small increment in groundwater pumping could result in dewatering critical habitat for an endangered species, or dewatering a stream that somebody else's surface supplies. So it's the tipping point issue and how you deal with that issue, and that's a critical issue for us. Whoops. I'll just mention on schedule. The only thing I'll draw your attention to on this is the top row. It's the steering committee. We've pledged to send to them this Friday a revised draft of our recommendations and the report. And we expect to work with them, probably call them, get comments through the 25th. And we plan on having a final report that we will submit to you as well as members of the legislature by the end of this month. And then continue working on refining and developing legislative language so we can be competitive with Bob, since he already has his legislative language. I'm back to this slide, this image, but just a couple things that I want to highlight here. You know, it has taken us 100 years to get here. In 1914, we made a decision to not include groundwater in our allocation system. I mean, it was a conscious decision. It was not an accident. They decided not to include it. And in doing so, we also didn't provide any tools to local entities to do this. So where we see good water management today, groundwater management, it typically is because they had a terrible crisis and massive litigation. They had the ocean running into the central groundwater basin in Southern California. And so we've developed very sophisticated groundwater management mechanisms in other parts of the state, but only through crisis. And we have to stop that cycle. I mean, we have to get our arms around this and get out in front of it. We've made conscious decisions about reallocating water from using out of the system back to the environment. That's a conscious decision. It had an immediate impact of increasing groundwater pumping in the state. So we didn't stumble into this, and it's not an issue of good versus evil. We made all of these conscious decisions and provided all of these incentives to be where we are today. And we ran into a lot of finger pointing on this. But at the end of the day, this is our problem. We all own it. We got here by conscious decisions. And I put up there that it's we've got to avoid a slow-moving disaster. Well, it's accelerating, and accelerating big time this year. And I don't think we have time to be circumspect about this. I don't think we have time to avoid some of the political difficulties that we will experience. We need to act now. And if we don't act in the legislature in a coherent way, then we're going to act in the courts very quickly in an incoherent way, in my opinion. Again, no offense to attorneys in the room or judges that may be listening in. So that concludes my comments, and we will get our final report to you very quickly. Thank you.
Lester, thank you. That is comprehensive, and I appreciate your closing comments very much. Questions from the panel? Comments from the panel? Debbie.
Thank you. That was incredibly comprehensive, and very tricky. I wonder, did you talk to the group at all about the potential to phase things? You know, are there critical things we have to do this year? Other things we might get to later? And if so, do you have a sense of that kind of rollout?
Now, that's a great question, and Gordon had asked me that question previously, and in most of our discussions, we have not raised that. We have not focused on how would you phase this. We've focused on what's the solution to the problem. And I think you raise a kind of a logical discussion, but my view at this point is I'd like to get a whole bill or several bills in play and have the discussion in the legislature about how do we move forward on this. And you have a number of people on the panels here that participated in our process and may have opinions about that, but we decided to focus on what's the big fix.
Felicia, is your microphone up?
No, it's just sitting there.
Oh.
I'll listen. I probably will have a question, but I want to listen to other people's questions
Okay.
first.
Martha?
There's been a little discussion in the legislature already on the first part of the actual getting these governance structures together. Have you had any thoughts about the role of LAFCO or any other kind of administrative role to facilitate that under this timeline?
Yeah, at this point, we've only identified we need to figure out where LAFCO fits into this, as well as, I mean, most of our thinking, we haven't even thought about how this needs to go through local government committee in the legislature and where that fits in. And some of it, if they do this by an MOU and pull things together, that's one thing. JPA is kind of a higher level, and then if they form a new entity, that's something quite different. So I think we need to flesh that out, but we have not addressed directly the LAFCO issue.
On the question of governance, I think that the basic structure, you and I have talked about this, is to sort of build off of the AB 3030 structure. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the notion of trying to essentially incentivize groups to get a governance, a single governance entity over a sub-base, and before they get some of the authorities that otherwise would come to them. Because AB 3030, as it presently is, and as like Mr. Reeves' group would have just all these options available for people to pick up. So maybe talk a little bit about why you would hold some of those back.
Yeah, the first thing I would go to, just in terms of pure incentive, is I think, again, this could happen in a bond or it could happen in other ways, that you reserve money exclusively for those that have formed and cover an entire subbasin. And when they do that in an acceptable way, they have access to monies that others would not have access to. And I think that's something we really need to focus on. You know, I think we've had conceptual discussions about segmenting the authorities. Do this and you get this authority, but not at a level that I'm really confident in at this point. I mean, I really would like to see these formed and they get the suite of authorities and they start working on them. But I do think a financial incentive would be quite compelling.
Lester, I don't recall very many specifics on an appropriate state backdrop, but I'm also very interested in, and maybe it's too early for you to give many details about how to shorten the timeline and the process for adjudication. And is the state involved in that piece?
There's two thoughts on the administrative adjudications. One that maybe goes more to the shortening issue is you form the jurisdiction, you go through the process, you've characterized your basin, somebody doesn't like what you're doing. And so the thought is you would access an administrative law judge and you would set up an adjudication, but you've already developed the technical record, and which is identifying the parties, and the technical record is probably what takes the most time and money in a court adjudication. So you've already gone through the planning process. So this would be a tool used largely at the local level when you have a dispute, and someone would have to avail themselves of this before they went to court. So there's a thought that that could save time and money. The other thought is identifying a very discrete or very specific adjudication process that the court or the state would use as one of its intervention techniques. You didn't do your plan, you're missing all your targets, we're going to initiate an adjudication.
No, thanks. Those questions were all along the lines that I had. Just a couple things for a little more elaboration, and I know that your process isn't completely through. It strikes me that one of the most challenging things, going back to your map of overlying jurisdictions and gaps in jurisdictions, is that in some cases is going to be the hardest part. And part of the theory of the folks who are in the state backstop as threat being a very important piece, which I've heard from quite a lot of people, in addition to the fears people have about it, is that there's a threat of that. And so, because people would rather get together and do it themselves than have somebody off in Sacramento do it, which is a feeling I shared when I was a local government official as well. It is a powerful motivating force. Your group talked more about other things that can help folks be able to pull that together. I mean, in some areas, I think that can happen very quickly. In others, particularly with the white spots and others, it seems like it might be really difficult, even within a 2-year time frame. And I'm not suggesting a longer time frame. I'd just like you to elaborate on that a little bit, and even a little bit more on the conversations, again, not to pull it to closure, on the nature of the backstop tools that people might like. The idea of doing the adjudication light or quicker speed adjudication, speed being a relative concept, or other things that people think that might be interim steps.
Well, to your issue of formation, when I think back on when we were talking about the single entity covering a subbasin, there was strong agreement that that's what's desired, is to manage on a subbasin basis. And the thought of having an easy mechanism to form, you know, I'll start maybe with the biggest change, to form a special act district. Right now you have to take your district and go to the legislature and deal with it that way. So you have the ability to simply elect under the statute that would be passed. The other motivations for bringing the entities together, everybody talked early on the state stick, that if we don't do it, somebody else is going to. Adjudications, that if the conflicts increase, people are going to start filing suit. And so we better pull this together. Financial, that if you pull together and are doing it, all pulling at the same oar, that if you have access to more money, and those are the basic motivations. I think what's happening much more broadly is now that this is getting more and more real, people are starting to focus a lot more on the details. And I think even within the last week, we've seen a much higher level of focus on the details by people that probably a year ago would have just said that they would oppose anything that dealt with groundwater. So there's a big sea change, and I think one of the, your questions is going to one of those issues that people are starting to focus on now. And it deals sometimes with the competition in a subbasin. And we're doing it better than them, and we always have. So how do you overcome that? So again, I think it is, you've got some time to work on this, but if you don't deal with it, somebody else is going to deal with it, either a court or a state agency. And then if you can sweeten that with money, that helps immensely.
Okay, Gary, last one, and then I want to quickly turn it over to our review panel.
Yeah, Lester, great presentation. Just one thing, there's a number of plans that are going on regionally, as you know, from urban management plans, groundwater management plans, and of course the recent regional water management. How would you see that effort to bring efficiencies to that, and how that would work under some new governance?
Yeah, there's been some discussion that it'd be natural to combine the groundwater management plans and the regional integrated water management plans. We have not dealt with the details of how that would work. But, I mean, that's a good point. I mean, in fact, that's one of the criticisms we got when we talked with a lot of local government folks. Oh, great, here's another state program, one more jurisdiction, one more set of reports. And that, it goes to that just small phrase we had about regulatory relief. If people want to see if they're doing something new, that somehow it satisfies another requirement, but we have not gotten into the details on that.
Helpful. To any of our review panel, yes, Ken, we'll start with you.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Snow, for that presentation. That was great. Question I have, it relates to your comments about Kern County and Semi-Tropic, which are great programs, done a great job down there, and to some of our senior right holders, large water entities, not this year, but in the coming years when they have excess water. How does the beneficial use issue apply to groundwater storage? Does that classify as beneficial use? I don't know. I've been asked that question myself.
Well, Tim or Felicia may be better on this one. My understanding, though, is that just groundwater recharge is not defined as a beneficial use. It would depend on what the water goes to when you take it out. That has been identified as an issue, I think, by a number of parties, that groundwater should purely on its own be a beneficial use and not have to talk about where the water goes. But why don't somebody who knows what they're talking about jump in?
I'm not an attorney, so I probably don't know what I'm talking about on this issue. Aqua's groundwater framework document from a couple of years ago identified this as one of the barriers because the reality is if you want to do a recharge project, you have to determine whether or not it's consistent with your license and permit, and if it isn't, you come to the state board and seek clarity, which creates process, risk, cost. And the Aqua recommendation was that we look at whether or not it's appropriate to just designate generally that groundwater recharge in a conjunctive management basin is a beneficial use and move forward.
I'm just thinking that might be something that could help when there is excess water and it could be put to that use. That would make it easier.
Tim? Yes.
Actually, I have a couple of questions, and it kind of is a spin-off of Gary's comment on the integrated regional water management plan. Certainly, in some cases, they are actually integrated. The groundwater management plans are integrated, but I think that would be one thing that we could flush out a little better. But I hate to bring this one up, but you know, there's 20% of the public supply wells are in fractured rock in the state. And so it's something that we can't let go under the radar. I was at DWR, as were you, Lester, and it's been discussed many times over the last decade or two that we need to get more information on those areas and address those areas. So I'm not sure how we, if you have any ideas on how to bring that into this framework. I know it may not be a high priority. I was up in the mountain counties a couple weeks ago, and there are wells going dry up there, just like everywhere else. So,
I think what I found, and I don't want anybody to think I'm speaking for any of the rural counties, but they were very concerned about this applying broad brush to them in their fractured rock situation. Also, though, I heard an interest in wanting assistance in figuring out what's going on with their water. Because as you know, in fractured rock, you can have neighbors with their wells, you know, 100 yards apart and completely different water quality and water characteristics, and so it's very, very difficult. But as we see continued development in those areas, there's a lot of interest in the part of I think some of the counties and some of the local governments to better understand what their water supply is.
and then just a follow-up on DWR. So you've mentioned, and by the way, I really appreciate the comprehensiveness of your effort and presentation. It's really refreshing to see some really well thought out ideas. But you've mentioned, you know, that DWR has a role to provide technical support, and you worked for DWR. You worked as the Secretary of Resources, and I'm wondering how that could be put together in a sustainable fashion, because DWR, its main effort is the State Water Project. So, and how do you really get it sustained, that they're going to have support for this initiative going forward? Do you need a new groundwater division or something, or how is that going to happen?
Well, Gary probably should answer that better than I could, but as you probably know, a lot of the groundwater expertise is out in the district offices, and not in Sacramento, although there is some there. So I think that's a model. It's almost more of a cooperative extension service model to have people out closer to where the stuff is happening. So I suspect both at the State Board and DWR, one of the issues is simply funding and positions to cover these kinds of things. But my sense is what people are looking for is that kind of personal touch expertise to help them, that people out in the region to come out and help them with data. You know, there's more and more interest in using satellite data. Well, most local districts don't have the ability to do that, so somebody needs to help them with that. So it's a genuine interest in, I'll call it a technical partner who isn't enforcing something on them. Right. And so it's that niche that I think would be welcomed. But I mean, there are funding issues, and those need to be addressed as part of this.
Okay, to move things along, did anyone else have their microphone up here? Laurel and then Frank, okay.
I just wanted to mention with this presentation, because I think it's one of the only ones that really talks about the administrative adjudication role in particular in a little bit more detail. But I think on that one, you know, I would really hope that we include one of the benefits of having the state, you know, allow that to proceed more swiftly and cheaply, hopefully, is also the ability to enable more people to be able to participate that may not be able to afford to have legal representation through normal judicial adjudication that can be extremely costly. And the California Public Utilities Commission has a model program through the intervenor compensation program that they have that we might want to look at. But I would really encourage that to be a really key component that the state look at for making sure that this is truly inclusive and equitable process.
Good point. Frank, and then Maurice, if you have anything, we'll try to move it along here. Thanks.
Okay, just to relate a little bit from where I'm from, which is East Stanislaus County, and these are areas outside of the Oakdale Irrigation District. We do not provide water there. Recently, there's been 15,000 acres of almonds planted there. There's 15,000 additional acres projected. There's 10,000 acres that have potential planting possibilities. Almonds as far as the eye can see. If you ever want to go for a Sunday drive, go out there. You think you're in a tropical forest. 200 new wells, either drilled or on permits being requested. These are 16 to 24-inch drills, or wells. At OID, we have 22 wells, and over the last 5 years, we've seen a drop in water levels as much as 20 feet. And the pumping is kind of just beginning. I think new plantings beyond surface water availability should go through the same process as a subdivision. When you want to go out there and plant thousands of acres of almonds, I think you should have to say where the water is going to come from, what's the impact on others who are dependent on groundwater, to include many municipalities. LAFCO needs to be a player concerning this issue. There are many people east of Oakdale and down toward Turlock, their wells are going dry. And these are people on ranchettes, small houses, maybe small farms. It costs $20,000 to put in a new well. Many of those people can't afford that, and that issue has to be addressed.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Did you have anything?
I don't think so.
Maurice, thank you. Lester, thank you for that comprehensive overview. We look forward to your final report. And I want to encourage you, because I know you have someone who's a significant player in the UC system. I think there's some tremendous opportunities to think about partnership with cooperative extension in ways that we have not traditionally done, but it works for us in our animal lab, where we have our lab as part of the UC system. It gives us cutting-edge diagnostic tools. It gives real-life experience to researchers. And this could be a unique way for the 21st century of getting that kind of on-the-grounds local expertise engaged. And I would just encourage you to explore that as a really out-of-the-box way of solving some of these issues on technical expertise. And with that, I'm very pleased to welcome Mr. Quinn and Mr. Orth to present the Aqua Plan. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dave and I are going to be the tag team to present with you. We do have a imperfect but out there, approved by our board of directors, recommended plan. I think it's probably good news that you're going to hear an awful lot of overlap between what you just heard from Lester and what you'll hear from Aqua. My goal is to give Dave most of the time to walk you through the specifics of the proposal. I would like to set some policy context here. Let me start with the fact that it should be obvious to everyone in this room that Aqua takes this issue very seriously. That was underscored in an op-ed printed today in the Sacramento Bee. I'm sure the timing by the editorial board was purely coincidental that you happened to be meeting this morning. But it does underscore that the leadership of our organization really cares about this issue. It's also notable that Aqua's Vice President, Kathy Teagues, is in the audience today because she wanted to be here to see this proceeding in person. And since the day I walked into my new office 7 years ago, the groundwater issue has become more and more important as things in California have unfolded. The board as a whole first took action on this issue in 2009 when they adopted a set of groundwater policy principles. Secretary Ross, that basically met your first criteria. We said this is a really big deal and it must be managed at the local level. That was the essence of the principle statement in 2009. In 2011, we followed that with putting a little more meat on the bones. And I think going to your second criteria, with local control must come local responsibility. And Aqua had a history of protecting locals no matter what, and we were basically saying you have to use your local control for sustainable outcomes locally, and we'll lay on the railroad tracks to assure that if you're not being responsible, we will no longer be a shield between you and what the state might do. That was, I think, the essence of that second statement. It became clear as time passed that we needed to be much more specific about what all of that meant. And last year, the board created this Groundwater Sustainability Task Force. My wife has given me the same problem about the acronym. I call it GUSTOF around the dinner table. Our outgoing president, Randy Record, was the chair. David Orth, who do the detailed presentation here, was the vice chair. If you count them, there are 14 names of 14 members of my board of directors. There are actually 12 and 2 alternates for 2 board members. This is a product of the board of directors reaching out, as we always do, to our members and getting diverse output. But this is something, these people listed here put in a lot of their time on this issue out of dedication to trying to get it right and look at things, as we always do, from a lot of different angles. 36 members of the Aqua Board of Directors, very diverse. They never let go of their diversity, but they try to act together. They unanimously supported the document that will be just described for you today at their last meeting just a couple of weeks ago. What we're trying to do with this new task force effort is to develop very specific recommendations for how we believe we should move forward, getting ready for, we think, legislation that's likely to happen this year. In addition to assuring local control, we are looking for specifics about what tools do we need as local managers. What the thresholds was the word that we used for defined requirements in the process. What should those thresholds look like? How do we convince you that we are in fact meeting the standards that have been set consistent with state guidelines and law? And then third, what would be the role of the state if the locals default? I must tell you, our role is to minimize your role. I will be happiest if there's not a single groundwater basin that you think you need to go out and torment the poor locals because we have done such a good job. Before I turn it over to Dave, I do want to make one really important statement. We put this out there. There's a lot of meat on this bone. We believe this is a bold proposal that will get us in trouble with some, and we put it out there only as part of a comprehensive statewide plan. If you just dump sustainability in the laps of the locals and then walk away from your responsibility to do what you've committed to do in the California Water Action Plan, California will be a nightmare of a place to live in years to come. This has to be approached as only one part of, a key part, but only one part of a strategy that is investing in storage and integrating operations with groundwater basins, that's fixing the delta, that's getting demands down, that's investing in habitat so that we have a functioning environment over the time. We have to do all of those things. If we don't do this as part of that comprehensive plan, it will not pay out. We might as well let them go to hell in a handbasket if we're not going to make it part of a comprehensive program that's working for the state as a whole. When Dave's done, I'm going to come back with some closing remarks about where Aqua intends to go from here, but I'll turn it over to Dave. And clicker number 1.
Thank you. Absolute pleasure to be here this morning, and unfortunately I look at that screen of Aqua's history. I was connected with the previous 2 documents, so I guess I'm not smart enough to step back when people are looking for volunteers, but I mean, seriously, I do obviously take groundwater management, groundwater policy very, very seriously, and my board and I consider it a worthwhile investment of time to spend a lot of time in this discussion, but also I think just in context recognize that what I do back home in the Kings River is also aggressively implement an irrigated lands regulatory program through a third-party coalition, so we've got a water quality component in our business and a very successful integrated regional water management plan. So let me just try to hit some highlights in the Aqua paper. As Tim pointed out, you will see a great deal of parallels to what you heard from Lester. And I think that shows that there's some consistent thinking and where we need to go. I'm going to try to provide enough time for you all to ask questions, so if I skip over something, you know, raise your hand or bring that back around in question. First of all, the task force proposed and the board adopted 11 basic policy objectives that needed to be considered in context as the backdrop to these recommendations, and they're identified here. We've talked about some of these concepts, that we do what's necessary to allow the local and regional management agencies to take this on and succeed, and while we tend, when we talk about this, to focus on and paint a very broad brush negative picture, there are lots of successes out there, and we need to leverage those successes into the areas that need additional assistance. We recommend consideration of establishing minimum groundwater management plan requirements. Right now, as both Mr. Reeb and others have pointed out, within the California Water Code, you have a choice of doing an AB 3030 plan or adopting a plan that also has the SB 1938 requirements, which are a little bit more stringent and also have a more definitive public process involved in them, have defined basin management objective criteria. Aqua believes that that has to be the new standard, that we can't allow for discretion of agencies to decide that they're only going to adopt part of a groundwater management plan. Obviously, a basic policy principle is to avoid and minimize subsidence. Subsidence is one of the big reasons we're here today, because it's the indicator of mismanagement. We recognize the connection between groundwater and surface water. This is one of the policy objectives that are written into SB 1938, but frankly, as DWR recently pointed out in an assessment of 1938 plans, we haven't got that right yet, so we need to figure out what that is and how to apply it in a groundwater management strategy, recognizing that in many cases, and Mr. Hall's educated me at length on this, that you know, groundwater connection to surface water is affecting the flows of those surface waters and the uses of those surface waters, and with the integrated planning context, they're critically important. Data availability, we talked a little bit about that today. Aqua has a groundwater committee, has a groundwater management data working group trying to define the context and framework of what a good data program looks like. I would say that it's going to have to include enhanced monitoring and modeling and reporting and analysis, and we're supportive of moving that forward. CASGIM has provided a great foundation and a great access tool for the public to see changes in groundwater elevations. We need to take that to the next level. We need to address whatever's necessary to increase groundwater storage, and we talked a little bit earlier about the importance of groundwater storage as part of a broader context. Remove impediments to recharge. This involves both expedited processes for approval of recharge projects, but also looking specifically at regulatory and policy barriers to getting excess water into the ground when it's available. I think it's critical to recognize again the successes, and whatever we do, we shouldn't create harm to the successful programs in this state. So the do no harm concept is really aimed at let's add tools, let's not create additional burdens for those who are already doing a very good job. Reassessing surface water reallocations. Here, my suggestion is that the State Board and the other agencies need to think integrated, just like you ask us to think integrated when we manage surface and groundwater resources. And too often there are decisions made in this room, there are decisions made in other rooms that tend to focus narrowly on a surface water management strategy, water quality, flow, that has a potential negative groundwater management impact, and we need to think more broadly about those things. We've talked a lot about state financial and technical assistance. I am, the Kings Basin is a beneficiary of a significant amount of financial and technical assistance, which has given us a significant head start into groundwater management, and we would recognize, as others have, that that's an important role for the state to take here, and then specific backstop, which I'll discuss here in a bit. So 8 recommendations. The first recommendation, like the California Water Foundation, is that we incorporate into statute a definition of sustainable groundwater management. It's interesting that in SB 1938, as it amended the California Water Code in 2002, it provided guidance to local agencies to set basin management objectives for quantity, quality, subsidence, and surface groundwater connection if we wanted money from the state, so it was conditional. But it didn't say what those objectives should try to achieve. So the task force and the board ultimately strongly recognize that if we're going to move this thing forward, I call this the speed limit. We need to set the speed limit. We need to define what sustainable management looks like. And while these words are different than the words that the California Water Foundation put up, they are similar in concept. This definition was developed carefully through the task force, starting with a recommendation for sustainability, or a definition for sustainability that was included in the 2009 framework, was reviewed in context to a recent USGS sustainability definition, and then kind of melded together to come up with this. This is critical. These might not be the right words, but this is critical for our statute. We've talked a little bit about focusing on unmanaged basins and subbasins. The priority needs to be given to the wide areas. We've discussed that extensively. We've also recommended that the CASGIM basin prioritization methods that were discussed earlier are the ways that we can focus on high and medium priority basins as well. The third recommendation was to adopt some uniform minimum requirements for groundwater management plans. We have some suggestions about planning boundary that are a bit different than the California Water Foundation, in that the recommendation is that preferably subbasins should be managed by a single plan and a single entity, but again, recognizing that in many areas of the state we have multiple plans that have been coordinated, that are working cooperatively. We shouldn't create a requirement that forces them to do something that's not beneficial to their local plan. So the concept here was an acknowledgement that where there are multiple existing plans within a subbasin, that they should demonstrate coordination and cooperation amongst each other to meet the common goal of subbasin sustainability. Connectivity could be established through an MOU or through some other types of structures. Plan standards, we've already talked about the minimum plan standard of SB 1938. Compliance requirements, basically a recommendation that groundwater management plans be updated to this new legislative standard for medium and high priority basins as defined by the CASGEM process within 5 years, that we meet a sustainability objective within 20, but recognize that even that 20, as long as it may seem, is part of a very long planning horizon that groundwater managers and integrated regional water management planning lenses have to look through. A recommendation that we look at these undeveloped lands and these so-called white areas and consider a prohibition from any groundwater use from an area that is not covered by a groundwater management plan. Our encouragement here is that the locals need to come together and develop a plan before they start using a resource that they don't understand. Role for technical review and approval of the prepared plans by the Department of Water Resources with annual performance reporting to the department, and then a 5-year performance review through the State Water Resources Control Board for those high and medium priority basins. And the thinking there is that groundwater management planning agencies would come in and say, here's our 20-year plan to sustainability and here's our progress report. And if there isn't progress, we'll talk a little bit later about what the impacts of that or the results of that might be. Recommendation number 4 is that we, again, use the vast resource that's available, the technical knowledge that's available at the Department of Water Resources. I understand the funding challenges here, but we need to create kind of a best management practices guidebook that addresses these various issues and get that in the hands of these local agencies, some of which exist but need assistance, some of which don't exist yet and are going to need to be told, you know, here are the best ways to develop a groundwater management plan and the components that it should include. We tried to address a long-standing question through this debate that started, you know, months ago as to what additional local and regional agency authority should be granted to local management agencies. And our recommendation here is that we grant these authorities not as mandates, but as tools that local agencies can consider and use to meet their sustainability objective. So we've talked plenty about fees. Obviously, it costs money to do this, everywhere from preparing a plan to developing the information to understand your basin, to implementing corrective actions or actions that get you to sustainability. So we have to address the fee issue. A recommendation that with careful consideration, and this is a point I think we could have made better in the report, and in fact, if I were to rewrite this, I probably would have made this our 12th policy objective, is that we have to, and it's been acknowledged earlier, carefully consider existing property rights to groundwater and land use. But in doing so, we need to figure out how to give the local agencies the ability to set extraction limits and groundwater and allocate groundwater use. That there needs to be a stronger connection between groundwater management and well permitting. We have different models in different areas of the state, but there needs to be a better connection so that when the counties, in counties where they do well permitting, that there is a consideration of groundwater management plan requirements and conditions before they continue to grant new well permits. Some recommendations on how to deal with enforcement, and you heard from Mr. Reeb that the long-standing knowledge is that we've all had some authorities granted in AB 3030 and SB 1938, the Water Code statute, but they're not terribly enforceable, and so it's hard for a water agency to go down the path of setting a fee and setting perhaps into motion some of the other tools that exist in AB 3030, only to know that the first landowner who says, I'm not going to comply, you know, we're into a battle that's just not worth it. So we need to figure out how to expedite enforcement provisions, and there are recommendations in the Aqua paper in that regard. We recommend a stronger connection between land use decisions and water supply through will serve letters, as well as groundwater management plan and general plan consistency determinations. We've actually created a new phrase in addition to the water availability determination that's currently made for certain urban developments, that we do a groundwater management plan consistency determination for new proposed industrial, residential, new proposed, and agricultural development, including permanent crops. So